Good afternoon to those in the room, those who are live streaming this, and those who will learn about it a bit later because it will be a fabulous event and they will want to know about it. I'm Jane Harman, the President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and would like to welcome you to the third annual Brown Capital Management Africa Forum, which is the signature event of our Africa program, which is so ably led by the woman to my left, Dr. Tielman Nieuwoudt. We have in this audience or listening in representatives of the African Diplomatic Corps, International Diplomatic Corps, over 10 U.S. government agencies, business think tanks and NGOs, and generally smart people, because if you come to the Wilson Center, you are smart by definition. I'm delighted to be here in person. That hasn't happened at every one of these forums, to brag about good friends who are not here in person, and they are Eddie and Sylvia Brown, the funders and founders of this wonderful program. They can't be here with us today, but in their stead, I'd like to welcome Keith Lee. Now, where is Keith Lee? There he is. How can you miss Keith Lee, actually? Keith Lee, who is President and COO at Brown Capital Management in Baltimore. The two prior events of this forum were, one, the role of sovereign wealth funds in Africa's sustainable development, and two, enhancing U.S.-Africa economic relations following the 2014 U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. Launched in September 2015, as I mentioned, the Brown Forum, the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum, is a best-in-class program for bringing together business, political, and academic leaders around key economic, trade, and investment issues in Africa and in U.S.-Africa economic relations. Eddie and Sylvia are incredible. We will all attest to that. And they are generous champions of our work. And again, thank you, Eddie and Sylvia, wherever you may be today. Today, an expert panel will bring together government and private sector viewpoints on a crucial issue, which is the challenges to supply chains in Africa and their potential role in promoting sustainable economic development across the continent. Supply chains are key to increasing intra-Africa trade and boosting development. Simply put, they are about the effective and efficient coordination and management of activities and services associated with sourcing raw materials, adding value to those raw materials through manufacturing, and getting them to the consumer as final goods in a timely and most effective manner. While they are not the only factor, it is true to say that Africa's supply chain challenges help to explain why the continent accounts for less than 3% of global trade. Think about the population in the continent of Africa and the fact that there are 54 countries, right, Monday? 54 countries. How can the trade stats be this dismal? So, how do we get to a place where African countries are perceived not just as a source of raw materials, but also as places that can support globally competitive manufacturing and services? Our event today is designed to help understand the challenges and to offer options for how Africa and her partners, including the United States, could work together more effectively to address these challenges. We have speakers, and they will be introduced carefully by Dr. Nieuwoudt, representing the U.S. government, the corporate sector, and the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa, as well as leaders from Africa's regional economic communities and its corporate sector. We sincerely appreciate your time and sharing of expertise and look forward to a fabulous discussion. Again, welcome to the third Brown Capital Forum, and please welcome our brilliant and indispensable director of our Africa program, Tielman Nieuwoudt.
Thank you, Congresswoman Harman. I know you have to run, but we appreciate you stopping by to open our proceedings. Let me invite Mr. Keith Lee to come and offer a few words of welcome before we get started with our proceedings. Mr. Lee?
Thank you, Monday. Good afternoon, everyone. My colleagues and I would like to welcome you to the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum. Through this series of events, we strive to expand the conversation about critical issues, bringing both the challenges and opportunities to the forefront of policy conversations. Our expert panelists, comprised of industry experts, private sector leaders, and policymakers, enlighten and educate us through a broad lens of diverse viewpoints and experiences. We are proud to partner with the Wilson Center, and we would like to especially thank Dr. Mande Muyangwa and Congresswoman Jane Harman for bringing us together today. At Brown Capital Management, we invest in global companies of all sizes. As analysts, we certainly appreciate and understand how critically important supply chain management is to businesses who strive to maximize customer value and achieve a sustainable competitive advantage. As difficult as it is for these companies to develop supply chain strategies, imagine the complexities facing supply chains across the continent. This afternoon, we will focus on the complex issue of supply chains in Africa, as Congresswoman Harman mentioned. We will look at what are the challenges and how do they impact trade and development. Are there regional or global success stories that we can replicate through lessons learned? Our panel will share their experiences, identify best practices, and offer concrete and practical recommendations to address Africa's supply chain challenges. Again, thank you all for your continued interest in and support of the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum. And Monday, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Before I introduce our guests, let me quickly welcome those of you who are joining us via webcast and on Twitter. I welcome all of you. You can participate in today's event by following the Africa Program's Twitter account, Africa Up Close, and you can contribute to the discussion using the hashtag @AfricaSupplyChains, all one word. So thank you very much, Mr. Lee. We really appreciate the opportunity to work with you on this forum. Let me quickly add to the context that both Mr. Lee and Congresswoman Harman established to sort of give the backdrop against which our speakers are going to be addressing these issues. Over the last 15 years or so, Africa has accounted for some of the fastest growing economies in the world. In fact, we all know by now that in the decade ending 2014, Africa accounted for 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world. Despite this growth, as Congresswoman Harman already stated, Africa accounts for less than 3% of global trade. Intra-regional trade figures are only slightly better at approximately 11 to 15% of trade. But it is worth noting that some regions, such as East Africa, have seen a steady increase in intra-regional trade, in part by addressing some of the issues that we will be talking about today. The numbers that I've just mentioned are especially jarring when one looks at the many factors that could propel Africa from the margins of global trade and into a more central role. These include Africa's abundant natural resources, a growing middle class, a youthful demographic, and the growing use of technology. Our goal today is threefold. Let's identify the key challenges. Let's look at the progress and the lessons learned from that progress. And let's offer some concrete examples and recommendations of how we can address those challenges. Many believe that in far too many African countries, there are far too many unknowns, uncertainties, and bottlenecks along the supply chain continuum, and that this continues to negatively impact both investment and trade. Some of those challenges are well known: the poor infrastructure, unreliable electricity, information and technology voids, uncertain and unpredictable economic policy environments, and in some countries, far too much government red tape. Combined, all of this, plus the reluctance of many in the international community to look beyond Africa's negatives, to see the opportunities that reside on that continent, has led to a situation where the risk assessment and the cost of doing business are far too high, and therefore the reluctance to engage. So our speakers today from the United States and Africa, as well as one who bridges both the United States and Africa, will lead us through an in-depth discussion of these issues and offer some suggestions as to how we might go about addressing these challenges. They are practitioners. They have worked in this space for many, many years. I think a number of them over 20 years. They come at it from different angles, working with governments, working for the corporate sector, advising the President of the United States, sitting in the Commerce Department at very high levels, working on US-Africa engagement, serving with regional economic communities to train African companies on supply chains and other capacity building efforts, trying to highlight some of the opportunities that reside in frontier markets within Africa. And so it should be a really, really interesting and productive discussion. So let me introduce our speakers. Our keynote speaker today will be Mr. Seward Skip Jones, Jr., who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Middle East and Africa at the International Trade Administration of the US Department of Commerce. He leads over 159 career professionals, assisting US businesses to access and succeed in markets throughout the region. And he has broad expertise in trade promotion policy and commercial diplomacy. Mr. Jones will kick things off by offering the keynote and talking to us about why US-Africa economic relations matter and some of the issues that he sees in that supply chain environment, sitting on this end of the ocean as someone who is tasked with trying to enhance US-Africa commercial relations. Mr. Jones.
Thank you. You want me up here? Or?
Wherever you're comfortable, sir.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Monday. That's a very kind introduction, and I think you and the Congresswoman have really set the stage well for our discussion today. I also want to thank the Wilson Center for inviting me and for organizing such a timely panel. It's an honor to be on this distinguished panel with such diverse expertise and experience. I have had the pleasure of working frequently with Laura in the past, and currently we are all benefiting from her efforts serving as Vice Chair of the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa. And I have enjoyed getting to know Chris, Tielman, and Sandra briefly this afternoon and look forward to their insights on this important topic. When President Trump attended the UN General Assembly meetings in September, he met with a number of African leaders and noted his goal to extend our economic partnerships with countries who are committed to self-reliance and to fostering opportunities for job creation for both Africa and the United States. And he further spoke of the tremendous business potential in Africa, stating that it would be the goal of his administration to work towards increasing trade and investment across diverse industries in the bilateral relationship. The Commerce Department, responding to this opportunity and to the feedback that we've received from so many US companies, both large and small, has made expanding commercial ties with Africa a very high priority in our overall objectives and outlooks. Mondi's already talked a little bit about the trends. She talked about the 6 of the African nations being among the top 10 fastest growing countries in the world over the past decade. Looking out over the next 5 years, it looks like 19 sub-Saharan African countries are expected to achieve growth rates of 5% or higher per annum, which is a pretty remarkable feat. And studies by McKinsey estimate that by 2025, an additional 90 million African households will enter the consumer class, bringing the middle class up to roughly 400 million people out of a total population of 1.4 billion, with total household purchasing power of somewhere in the vicinity of $2 trillion. So very important economic growth, very important and rising middle class, consumer class. In 2016, U.S. exports to Africa were just around $22 billion, and that was nearly double the total in 2000. And in fact, total trade between Africa and the United States was approximately $48 billion last year, up about $10 billion since 2000. So in this context, I certainly want to applaud the focus that the Wilson Center is bringing this afternoon to the supply chain development issues. One can examine this question in a whole variety of ways. Regional supply chain development is a vital component to successful regional economic integration efforts, to which African countries look as an engine for economic growth and development. Going up a notch, integration of African economies into global value chains can also be a very powerful engine for boosting African employment and for boosting incomes in labor surplus economies. As wages rise in some of the other countries already plugged into the global economy, perhaps a bit more, in Asian countries, for example, global value chain lead companies will be looking to find new production platforms, and in that context, Africa looms large. So African countries logically stand to benefit from this trend, but their ability to take full advantage of the opportunity will really be heavily influenced by the degree to which they manage to reduce trade costs and reform business climates. This all to facilitate trade and investment. So this matter of reducing trade costs and the question of whether the business environment is welcoming continues to be one of the major obstacles that we hear about from U.S. companies that are looking to export more or engage more in Africa. In a recent article, two African Development Bank economists noted that Africa faces the largest trade costs of any region in the world, and went on to note that many of those costs are man-made. For example, they made this following analogy. The effective speed of road transport within the South African development community is between 6 to 12 kilometers per hour. That's no faster than a donkey can trot. Thus, despite a vastly improved transportation technology base and road infrastructure over the past century, today's frequent internal checkpoints, multiple day waits at national borders, and other red tape barriers limit the overall average speed of bringing goods from the point of production to ports of embarkation to no more than a donkey's pace. One critical tool that African countries have available to help reduce these bureaucratic constraints and speed trade flows and reduce trade costs is the new World Trade Organization's Trade Facilitation Agreement, or TFA. This agreement streamlines customs operations, enhances transparency, focuses on removing red tape, and reducing costs to exporters and importers alike. And it came into force in February of this year. Now, trade facilitation measures can benefit all countries, whether they are exporting or importing, by allowing better and cheaper access to inputs for production and greater participation in the global value chains that characterize international trade today. As one analysis by African economists phrased it, essentially, the TFA is all about reducing trade costs. So why is this important for countries in Africa? Those high trade costs really can cut African countries, and particularly the landlocked among them, off from world markets, making African firms less competitive. And the competition among firms in the developing world to join light manufacturing value chains is fierce. World Bank research has shown that trade flows in intermediate goods that are the type normally traded within global value chains are much more sensitive to improvements in trade facilitation than flows of final goods. So implementing the TFA could reduce worldwide trade costs by anywhere from 12.5% to 17.5%, according to new analysis by the OECD, with the greatest of these benefits accruing in developing countries. The World Trade Organization, in its 2015 World Trade Report, found that TFA implementation could increase global merchandise exports by up to $1 trillion per year and boost global GDP growth by 0.5% per annum. So they also found that developing countries are poised to capture more than half of these available gains. What are the sectors that would benefit most from trade facilitation measures being implemented? Well, obvious ones like the express delivery industry, but also any industry with global supply chains, any industry focusing on just-in-time manufacturing, the cold chain industry, trade compliance and logistics firms, new-to-export firms, and very importantly, small businesses. Overall, the African continent has much work to do to ensure full ratification and implementation of this agreement. 22 African members have yet to ratify, accounting for over half of all remaining ratifications. 17 of those come from sub-Saharan Africa. So it is imperative, I think, that we prioritize full ratification and notifications from the sub-Saharan Africa in order to leverage the anticipated benefits of this agreement for all member economies. So without submitting instruments of acceptance and notifications, WTO members will not be able to access the technical assistance and capacity building opportunities that are built into the agreement and are available through the WTO and other multilateral institutions. And I know Laura's going to talk a little bit about the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation in a bit. So TFA implementation will ultimately help businesses participate more fully in global value chains, smooth the movement of goods across borders, and make goods from the region more competitive in global markets. I think I may have come close to exhausting my 8 minutes. I have a little bit to say about what the Commerce Department can do in this area, but I will skip that, hold that off for the question and answer sentence period. But to summarize the points, enhancing the U.S. commercial relationship with African countries is very important for this administration and for the U.S. business community. Second, greater integration into global supply chains affords a tremendous opportunity for African development. And getting to concrete recommendations, to take advantage of this opportunity, African countries need to work with the international community to reduce trade costs and reform the business climate, to encourage greater trade and investment. Implementing trade facilitation reforms, such as those in the World Trade Organization's Trade Facilitation Agreement, is a key tool to reduce the man-made trade costs. And finally, Commerce Department can play a key role in partnering with the African countries and other USG agencies, encouraging both implementation of the Trade Facilitation Agreement and then taking advantage of the commercial opportunities that arise thereafter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. I think you went right to the heart of the matter as we see it from a U.S. government perspective in terms of the important role that the World Trade Organization's Trade Facilitation Agreement could play in getting to the heart of all of those issues. I'm sure I know we have representatives from African embassies here. Perhaps they might also add to that discussion in talking to how African governments view the Trade Facilitation Agreement and whether there are points of confluence and perhaps points of disagreement, and then what we do about those. Let me now introduce our first on the speakers panel. It's going to be Ms. Laura Lane, who is the president of UPS Global Public Affairs. She is also the vice chair of the United States President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa. She has extensive experience working in the private sector. She has also served in the U.S. Foreign Service for 7 years, receiving 3 awards for her service. So she will bring to this discussion that big Fortune 500 company outlook, as well as a policy perspective from sitting on the PAC-DBIA. Ms. Lane, the mic is yours.
Thanks, Monday. I have to tell you, I'm thrilled to be here. Not just because I'm passionate about doing business in Africa, but I think it's just such a right time to be having this discussion. And I really want to focus us on one of the most critical issues that I see, which is trade facilitation. I'll begin by saying you all know Big Brown, right? UPS. We deliver holiday cheer, hopefully, to all of you. But we can also deliver on trade and development. And one of the ways we can do that is when we work in partnership with governments to really facilitate trade. UPS has a lot of experience crossing borders. We carry 3% of global GDP in our package cars, our tractor trailers, our sea containers, and in our airplane cargo holds, and we deliver in 220 countries and territories. On the continent of Africa, we currently serve 51 countries, and because of the liberalization that has occurred in a couple of the countries, we actually have 100% Brown-owned operations in South Africa and Morocco, and have a very significant presence in Nigeria. And boy, would I love for that to grow so that Big Brown can be in more places across the African continent, and not just operating through the agent relationships. We're really all about promoting that growth platform across the African continent. We want to do that by driving commerce and promoting that economic development that comes when the supply chains really work. And we see tremendous opportunities. You just have to look at the young, growing population, the rising middle class, the increasing political stability, and then you recognize there's a lot of opportunity for business growth and trade to be occurring. And when you have that rising middle class, what do they need? They need access to great health care. They need those technology products. They need the automotive, products. They need new sources of energy, and UPS wants to be helping to deliver all of that across the continent. And so when we look at it, we look at what is impeding some of that growth. And from that, we see for supply chains to really work, you gotta make those borders less thick. You gotta make them more efficient. Our brand is all about guaranteed delivery. And you know what? When things get stopped in customs or they don't get to the location on time, it hurts our brand, and we are essentially stopped at the borders in terms of being able to deliver for the customers that are shipping and the customers that are receiving. And so from our perspective, we really focus on what we can do in partnership with governments to focus on those customs issues, because we think that's what ultimately hurts trade and then in turn development. And so I know Skip touched on those customs issues, and I want to focus in on a few of them, 4 to be exact. And believe me, I know, going into government offices and you say, oh, I'm Laura Lane, I'm from UPS, I'm here to talk customs issues, and people just want to say, do I have another meeting or something? Because customs isn't that exciting and that sexy to talk about. But the reality is, it's fundamental. And so there's a couple of key areas where if the countries across the African continent could really focus in on improving their processes, they would unleash a lot of dynamism in terms of trade, not just across countries within regions, but between continents. And so first and foremost is there's a lack of pre-arrival clearance. That's key for companies like UPS. We depend on being able to send all the information about a package that's being shipped to customs well before it arrives at the border. So if there's any concerns, the package can be set aside. But if it's a package that represents a shipment from one of the good guys, it can clear customs quickly because the customs officials already have all of the information at hand. So having pre-arrival clearance is key. Second is not having this constant use of physical documents. We live in an electronic age. You can do so much more in terms of risk assessment and speeding the movement of packages across borders if you move things electronically. I would also note that bitstreams don't ask for bribes. And you know what? When you have packages with advanced clearance data sent ahead of time, you take the middleman out of that. And that is a challenge in many countries where fraud and corruption stop packages at the borders. And by the way, it hurts many companies, large and small, but especially the new ones that are going into trade. They can't afford to be paying bribes. By the way, nobody should be paying bribes at all. If you have electronic processes, you avoid all those kinds of questions because it moves electronically and customs officials can do their job and either clear or not clear. Finally, we really need to have de minimis levels that are set at the standard of e-commerce growth. De minimis is that fancy customs word for if a product is valued at a certain level or below, you don't have to go through the cumbersome process of paying any of the tariffs or taxes that are associated with that shipment of that product. That's powerful in the context of moving goods in and out quickly, especially for small and medium-sized businesses that are using the tools of technology to take their products and ship them around the world. In the United States, it took a while, 20 years to be exact, but we finally have a world-class standard for de minimis levels of $800. We would like to see countries moving in that direction so that all the cumbersome red tape that sometimes is associated with trade and the paperwork that goes along with it that slows down the process can be eliminated, and businesses can do what they do best, ship and sell goods to their customers. Skip touched on the TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement. What a powerful agreement, and compliments to the World Trade Organization for focusing on one of the fundamental issues that's so critical for trade. And we are thrilled that so many countries have finally ratified it. We recognize that many of these elements that I've just talked about improving customs procedures, are now codified in that agreement. But for many of the countries across Africa, we really understand that it's a matter of taking those terms of that agreement and now implementing them. And UPS and a number of other companies believe that we need to do that again in partnership with governments. And so we've joined in part with the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation to really lend our expertise on what good customs processes look like, partnering with governments, partnering with the World Customs Organization and the World Bank to provide the assistance so that countries across the African continent can implement that agreement and really harness a lot of the benefits that Skip touched on. You just have to look at those numbers and you know it's a no-brainer for every single country to want to implement that agreement. But we recognize that countries need that technical assistance and help. And so we have partnered through this Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation to provide that practical assistance. And I'm really excited about the fact that Ghana and Kenya are one of the first two that have projects already underway. Both of them focus on the pre-arrival processing capabilities, which are going to be powerful. Just watch the numbers in that economy after they get that process put in place. In Morocco, the project is focused on process harmonization, how to make it work better across all the different parts of government that have to clear products coming in and out. And there's a pipeline of projects being considered right now in Nigeria, Malawi, and Zambia. And so that's exciting because there is not only the commitments, but now the commitment to help governments implement these important commitments that they made in the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Last but not least, I am so proud to be serving as the Vice Chairwoman of the President's Advisory Council for Doing Business in Africa, because I'm a big believer in the opportunities that exist in many of the countries across the continent. And the council, by way of background, is made up of representatives, not just big companies like UPS or GE. The chairman is from GE, is Jay Ireland, but also smaller and medium-sized companies that recognize the opportunities. And it's from a lot of those companies that you get some of the best insights into what stops them from doing more in terms of trading more, because they've experienced those barriers probably more fundamentally than some of the larger companies do. We have been focusing on 3 aspects of our recommendations to Secretary of Commerce Ross in terms of how to get more engagement in a public-private partnership for doing more across Africa. We're looking at approaching Africa. How do you demystify what the opportunities are out there and encouraging more companies to look at those opportunities? How do you encourage more ability to compete across Africa? What are the key policies and changes that need to occur in order for companies to be able to compete there? And how do you operate across Africa? What is it going to take so that more companies can invest and grow there? And what are some of those changes that need to be made? And we're going to be presenting those recommendations at the end of November to the Secretary of Commerce and hopefully launching additional initiatives. And so I have to tell you, I'm really proud of the fact that this administration is continuing this important effort. And UPS, along with all of our customers and all of our business colleagues, are excited about the opportunities that are going to come from engaging in this public-private partnership to grow business across Africa. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Really appreciate your perspectives, both from UPS perspective, but also from the PAC-DBIA's perspective. So our next speaker is Mr. Chris Folayan. He is the co-founder and CEO of MallforAfrica, which is a platform that allows Africans to purchase items directly from international online retailers and get it delivered back on the continent. He is also a board chairman for the Africa Diaspora Network, a member of the U.S.-Nigeria Council, and a mentor for various companies based in Africa. I must stop here and say I met Chris for the first time in Kenya at the Global Entrepreneurship Summit. And I was really struck by him because he came across as a doer. You know, there are people who talk and talk and talk. And Chris just sort of run into this space against all the challenges where people were saying that couldn't succeed in an African context. And so I think he has a very interesting story to tell, and I'm glad that he is able to join us today. And I know that the MallforAfrica is expanding, so that's a good sign of growth. So he will be the first to bring that African-US perspective to this discussion, but from a practitioner's perspective, especially someone operating on the African continent with plans to expand big time. Chris.
Thank you very much. So I'll just give you a little bit background about the company, how it started, and dive into that because I think it will provide a lot of perspective. So MallforAfrica is a platform that allows US and UK, but I'll focus on the US, companies to deal in Africa and do business in Africa, more of the retail sector. So for example, if you are an eBay and you want to actually sell into Africa without any risk, that's where you'd look to us. So we have over 250 stores on our platform, and we help people in Africa buy from those stores. So the big question is, why don't these stores actually, ship to Africa? That's the hurdle that I had to face and the challenge I took on head on. And the biggest reason is, you think about U.S. companies think about retail companies think about Africa, and the first thing they think about, well, can they afford the products? Do they want the products? How can I get it there without any risk? What about the foreign exchange? When it gets there, if it's stolen, what happens? If it doesn't get to the customer, what happens? Return policies and so on and so forth. So the onus on building this company was to try and figure out, well, how can I take away all those risks so merchants want to do business in Africa and see that Africa is open for business. So I took that on as a personal challenge because I know people in Africa want to buy products from the US, and the companies in the US want to do business in Africa, but they saw that as a challenge. So we took away all the challenges, everything from fraud concerns all the way to shipping, last mile delivery, foreign exchange conversion rates and all that. We took away all of that via our patented platform and created literally an app that connected both the US and Africa together. So we connected it from a technology standpoint, taking care of all the risks and allowing people in Africa to finally have that ability to purchase products from the U.S. But the main issue really was getting the mindset, and getting the CEOs here and the merchants here to understand that, you know, Africa is not just big and an amazing continent, but it's also a continent that can do business with the states, and with or without too many policies in place, that things can ship and go through, and we can do business. So one of the key points to this amazing panel is to talk about supply chain and where I see it, and the defects that could come from it. And in order to improve supply chain in Africa, I've written a few points that I think need to be looked at. And this is from a grassroots perspective. I'm not a policies guy. I'm not into that, which is, I know I'm in DC, but I'm not a policies guy. But I truly believe that things happen from the grassroots and go up. There's not one-size-fits-all mechanisms or policies that can work across the continent. Each policy has to be focused on each country. Yes, there are some policies that you can flatline throughout the continent, and that would work. But if you focus on each country with a policy, I do feel it would improve how relationships go through. So looking at supply chain in Africa and doing business out of Africa, because we saw some issues there, and I'll get to that in a second. But the first one is to inform. So informing individuals in Africa about what kinds of products are needed in the States or across borders or intra-Africa, within Africa, informing people about what products they have that can be used in other parts of Africa is very important, and is not well done. It's done up to an extent, but that is a cavity that definitely needs to be filled. So informing people more about the products that they can sell out of Africa and they can sell within the continent. Educating people about how they can process whatever the product they have is. So for example, if you're looking at ginger in Nigeria, or hibiscus or chili peppers, how do you process it in order for somebody in the States to want that product? That's also a key piece that's missing. And then communication. So you've been informed, you've been educated, now you have to communicate with the buyer or the merchant on, you know, getting the product in, and that's where you start having the foreign exchange issues that you need to start looking at. Am I in a country that has an exchange or a currency that's not easily transferable or exchanged? You know, are the rates wonky and going up and down so rapidly that if I make a deal today, you know, tomorrow or in 3 days, I've lost so much money. So these are practical issues that people are facing on the ground. Delivery, how do I get products in and out of the continent? Have been an issue, and delivering products within the continent have been an issue. So you get into the whole infrastructure discussions, the roads. I have tomatoes somewhere, but I need to get the tomatoes from one part of the country to the other. And in many parts of Africa, you lose about 60 to 80% of merchandise that are perishable between one section to another because of refrigeration, power, and stuff like that. So you have to look at roads, and I know Skip mentioned the whole 6 kilometers per hour, donkey speeds. So that's where that takes you to. It's being unable to, even if you have amazing products, being unable to move the products within continents. And the last one is tech. Where does tech, how does tech play a role in all of this? And I do truly feel that with technology, you can communicate with different parts of the continent and different parts of the world and transport and move your products, because you're now informing people of, hey, I have a product. Do you want it? How can I get it out there? So putting stuff out there is really important. So I'll go back a little bit to the MallforAfrica platform. When we first started, it was about how do I get products from the US into Africa. I'm from Nigeria, so started in Nigeria, which I would say is the toughest country to want to deal with and even to open doors, because you say to somebody here in the States, I'm from Nigeria and I want to do business with you. They're like,
And I've got a bank account.
and I got a
that
bank
you can
account
send a
that you can
check
send
to.
checks to. Exactly. Then you know, it starts going, and you know, so in order for me to do what I've wanted to do, and it took about 5 years to get here. I had to convince CEOs and amazing corporations here in the States to want to do business in Africa in order for them to accept Africa and want to now receive products from Africa. Took me 5 years, but I can finally say we got there. And now, as of a few months ago, we just launched a campaign called the Out of Africa campaign with eBay. It's the very first time eBay has said, you know, you can go out there, accept African-made products. So these are items that are literally made on the side of the road by artisans. They can come to any of our locations, and we're teaching them and giving them the skills that they need in order to put products on our platform. All they need is a smartphone. We don't charge them a single dime. Put an item on a platform, and they can now sell it into the US. Now, that platform not only gives them a sense of confidence, but now imagine that guy under the bridge in Nigeria or in Kenya or anywhere in Africa that can now say, I can sell my products directly to somebody in the US. It gives them a sense of pride that you've never seen. If you just see their faces, the person that made the first sale, she was dancing forever. And it was a $45 sale, and that was the most amount of money she ever received over one purchase. And she was very happy. So I do think that there's a lot we can do. We don't, again, I'm not a policies guy. We don't have to wait for policies to happen. If you instinctively make things happen yourself from the grassroots going up, I think we can definitely make some changes. We've seen that with the Out of Africa campaign, partnering with eBay, providing people with that. So I do think as long as the guys who are making the policies and the guys who are making the investments in Africa can look at each continent, each country specifically, and look at the individuals in this country specifically and what they're doing to try and improve themselves, and make policies around that, it will definitely be a better continent. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Chris. So a lot there about domestication of policies to suit the environment that you're working on. Our third speaker will be Mr. Tielman Nieuwoudt, who is principal of the Supply Chain Lab, a consultancy focusing on factory to village supply chain solutions in emerging markets. He has worked with a number of multinational organizations, bilateral donors, and non-governmental organizations, engaging in more than 30 emerging market economies. He works on this issue for a living in both established and non-established markets in Africa, and he also works with small and medium-sized enterprises. And so we've asked him to bring that perspective to this discussion. Tielman?
Thanks very much, Moni. In 1999, I was living in Tanzania at the time, and I was working for a consumer goods company. And the operation I was working for purchased a manufacturing business in Ethiopia. So I moved from Dar es Salaam to Ethiopia, very excited to go to Ethiopia. But as a local manufacturer and consumer goods company, one of the first things we had to do was to figure out how we're going to get products into the country, inbound logistics. And most of the SMEs, multinationals we spoke to highlighted the fact just the difficulties in terms of customs, but also difficulties in terms of, dwell time at the airports. I mean, African ports in general are in the high double digits when you look at goods dwelling at ports. And Djibouti at the time was no exception. I mean, Ethiopia really lost access to the sea when Eritrea became independent. But once goods were in the country, we also had to get it to the end consumers. And if any of you have been to Ethiopia or have flown a small light aircraft over the country, you will know that people live everywhere. And because of poor road infrastructure, and especially back in the 1990s, it was extremely difficult to reach this population. In fact, our analysis showed that we could effectively only reach 15% of the population. So that provided us with a lot of difficulties. Also, in terms of the outlet base that we wanted to cover, unlike here in the United States or more developed markets, modern retail wasn't well established. So our network of retailers were really small kiosks, souks that we had to deal with. So it was very fragmented, which meant increased cost and complexity in the supply chain. Once we visited the smaller SMEs to get a better understanding of how they do business, we also discovered that most of them can't make purchases on a weekly basis, which for us would have been cost effective because of cash flow. One part was cash flow. They couldn't purchase for once a month. A lot of them also didn't have the credit, the cash flow and the credit facilities to do this. We looked at the beverage industry and we saw that, in fact, some of the returnable glass were loaned by intermediates. In some cases, intermediates such as wholesalers and sub-wholesalers would sell individual items to outlets because these shops just did not move the volume required to buy a carton or a case of goods. To reach upcountry areas, northern, southern areas, we saw that many retailers would go to open markets to purchase their products there. In this case, open markets, what they would do is they would purchase the good at the market, and then they would arrange for transport with various businesses. So say, for instance, I live in Mekelle and I go down to Addis Ababa. What I would do is I would, in a sort of like a early sharing economy, share transport to get my goods up to these northern areas. So lots of complexities. So why am I sharing my Ethiopian narrative with you? Well, in effect, Ethiopia is a mirror of some of the complexity and challenges that Africa face with logistics. 40% of African countries are landlocked, such as Ethiopia, one of the largest landlocked countries. Highly defragmented retail market, which means driving up cost if you have to deliver to these smaller shops. Urbanization rates still very low. I think Ethiopia right now is looking at 20%. Africa's urbanizing rapidly, but I think only by 2030 we'll reach 50%. So this lack of urbanization also increase complexity when you want to get goods to to consumers and to the market. Also, another thing that's very similar to the rest of the continent is even the time when I was living there, most of the construction was done by the Chinese. Ring road construction, the Bali airport construction was taken care of by the Chinese. So if you move further south and you look beyond Ethiopia, what are some of the other success stories? I think, Moni, you touched on the East African community. I mean, East Africa's still got a lot of issues to work out around the single customs and the open market. But if you look at the Logistics Performance Index of the World Bank, they've made massive progress. And in fact, even the landlocked countries from Rwanda, Uganda, particularly has improved. I mean, this in contrast with other regions where landlocked countries are actually performing much poorer than countries that have got access to the sea. So East Africa, for me, definitely stands out as a region that's made progress. Also in terms of the port, Nairobi, Mombasa Airport, 5 years ago, you were looking at dwell time at the port of anything from 2 to 3 weeks. Now, just to give you an example, I mean, Durban Port, which is fairly much in line with global standards, is 4 days. Nigerian ports right now, I think, is hovering at around 15 to 20 days. So, but East Africa, in particular Mombasa, has made huge progress in terms of reducing the dwell time and also increasing efficiencies. PPPs, public-private partnerships, a lot of excitement there, particularly around ports as well. We see a lot of interesting competition happening in the region. AP Mola, DP World from Dubai. I mean, there's almost not a week that goes by that I see yet another port concession being signed in even far-flung places such as Berbera in Somalia. So there is definitely interest in terms of PPP, and that's moving in the right direction. So what can African governments, companies, and private donors do to speed up this process, to accelerate this growth, and to become part of this positive narrative? Well, a lot of the trade agreements that Africa currently has in place is more on the short to medium term. And it's very resources focused. Even AGOA, I think, is 90% is petroleum. It's not focused on finished goods or intermediate goods. And that is one of the challenges that African governments face. Also, if you look at a lot of the special economic zones that have been designed by African governments, some of them have been a question of let's build it and see what happens. It hasn't been tied to global markets and global supply chains. Second of all, for African governments and companies to thrive, they need to become part of global standards and have the required skills to develop their supply chains. Standardization is critical. If African manufacturers can't be part of global accreditation, they can't compete in the global marketplace. Then lastly, I want to touch on technology. I think we've mentioned technology in this panel before. The World Bank estimates close to $100 billion a year that Africa requires to narrow that infrastructure gap. Technology can definitely play a part. It's not going to solve all the problems, but we've already seen interesting developments in terms of technology. I think, Laura, you touched on the initiative with in Rwanda, with the drone deliveries, which is happening, delivering medical supply. We've seen e-commerce developing. I mean, in places like Nigeria, Jumia, Congo has made big inroads. I mean, in my home country of South Africa, there's companies looking to tap into the shared economy, a company called Empty Trips, to create space for vehicles and for people on trucks. Also, location-based, geolocation-based is a big issue. Most African households and businesses don't have addresses. So, I mean, you would probably know this in your business. Delivering to these places is incredibly difficult. So companies like, Just Free Words have created like a geolocation system where it's easy to get to some of these businesses and households. So I think technology provides a real possibility. One of the challenges that we face in Africa with technology is the high cost. I mean, in South Africa, I think the highest trending word on Twitter right now is data must fall. I mean, that even outstrips Zuma must fall. Just because the cost of data, I mean, they've just done a comparison in Johannesburg, and I think Johannesburg versus London is 10 times more expensive. So in order for technology to thrive through investing in incubators, business incubators and startups, we need to drive down business cost. I think technology has a real potential, not just for the big multinationals sitting in London or here in the United States, but also for the SMEs, small Dukas shops sitting in the Makata market of Addis Ababa, of driving down cost and creating visibility along the supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tielman. I was smiling at your point about the geolocations. It reminded me of when I was going to school in England, trying to write letters back home to Zambia. And I'd always address my letters to my uncle as please deliver to the house with the corrugated iron roof. And they always got there. So, that's something special that only Africans would really understand in that context. So last but not least, our speaker will be Ms. Sandra Uwera, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the COMESA Business Council, which represents private sector interests in 19 countries in Africa, under the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, or COMESA as it's commonly known. She has over 17 years of regional experience in private sector development, and she deals with this issue with large, medium, and small-sized companies in the region. She runs a lot of training programs for African companies and works with the regional economic communities on the policy angle of this issue as well. So, Ms. Sandra, the mic is yours.
All right. Thank you. You know, the benefit of being the last speaker is that you have all the angles. You now know exactly what to talk about and you narrow your focus. So I hope I'm as interesting as everybody else. First and foremost, allow me to recognize our counterparts, our partners here. I see Madam Florizel from CCA. Thank you for coming. I also see our COMESA liaison office, Mr. Stephen Landy, he's here. So I'm sure in where I cannot contribute, you'll be able to participate as well. So I thank you for being here. Now, I just want to give you an impression of Africa. There's so much that's going on here, but I want to tell you that the COMESA region in general is about 552 million people. That is a huge market share. We have a global GDP as of 2016 of $772 billion US dollars. Now, within this particular market share, we have a diversity of Africans. Now, if you're an African, you know that we're a lifestyle economy. We love to dress well. We love to look good. We'll wear the finest shoe. We'll buy the best car. It doesn't matter how our houses look like. You know, we like to be trendy. So the African is a sophisticated consumer. It's the African person that you're seeing right next to you is urbanized. He's a sophisticated consumer, likes to shop for the product from wherever it is in spite of its expenses. So what does this mean for Africa? Today, intra-Africa trade is very, very low because there's a lack of consumer confidence in our own products. In spite of the fact that we put in a lot of efforts in the regulatory framework to ensure that we can we can create a seamless movement of goods and services across the region, we still have big challenges in terms of improving the quality and the standards of our products in the market. And I'm going to narrow down my focus to tell you about some of the challenges from the corporate's perspective, the small and medium enterprise perspective, so that we can actually agree on common solutions on how to solve this particular issue. So a lot of what we've discussed has touched on the regulatory aspect. Perhaps I can just come with a practical intervention on what we can do together. So from the supplier's perspective in Africa, we carried out a project called the Local Sourcing for Partnerships project that targeted about 6 countries in the region, and we looked to see how we could integrate small and medium enterprises into supply chains of larger corporate companies. The reason we did this is because we approached corporate companies to say, why aren't you sourcing your products from the local markets? Why do you buy similar products from international markets and sign long-term contractual agreements with companies that are based in Europe or the US, and yet you can actually source these products regionally or even within your domestic territories? And the companies came to us and said, it has to make commercial sense, you know? We have a reputation. As a business, we must make sure that we are providing quality products in time. We must have a first mover advantage. We must ensure that our customer gets the value they're expecting from us. If we don't do this, we'll lose our market share. And then they said, within the African market, there's a challenge. There's an inconsistency in supplying products. Products cannot get to us in time. We do not have a database that tells us that this is the credible supplier of a product. And then they also said another challenge that has always been prevalent within African markets is that businesses operate in silos. You will find so many similar small companies operating on their own, selling the same product to the same market. And yet if they all came together as clusters or consortia, they would be able to meet the purchasing requirements of a buyer by selling larger volumes of the same product and consistently. So these are the dynamics that actually came about. So we told the company, would you work with us if we trained the small and medium enterprises to meet your purchasing requirements as a buyer? And they said, yes, we'd work with you. And we approached this one company. I am not going to disclose the name of the company. They happened to be one of my members. So we worked with about 13 different companies across Africa, across the COMESA region, to meet this particular target. And they were willing to do so because it's also part of the responsible business practices of various companies that have invested in Africa to ensure that a percentage of their products come from the local market. However, it must make commercial sense to them. So when we approached the various small and medium enterprises, we focused on the agro-industry sector. Why? Because Africa is an agriculturally rich economy. Small and medium enterprises in Africa, 75% of the small and medium enterprises in Africa operate within the agriculture sector. And in fact, a larger base of employment in Africa is from within the agriculture sector. So we focused on horticulture, fresh foods, and processed goods. And we worked with these various businesses. Now, as we moved, as we continue to work within the project, we realized some of the key issues they faced is in terms of the most basic issues, business operations. Some of the companies did not actually see the reason as to why they should have a professional online interface. They wouldn't invest in that. They considered the fact that if you could call them on their phone, then if you as a supplier are available on your phone, that's just enough. They didn't realize that a buyer would want to be able to access you online at any time. If it's an American company, we have different time zones. You want to know that you're going to be able to access an African supplier online. So we marked this as a potential gap that we'd have to solve. Secondly, we also realized exactly what Mr. Tielman mentioned, that standard requirements was a very, very big issue. The cost of certification, the cost of standards compliance in Africa is very, very high. For a small and medium enterprise, at times, the annual revenue of an SME could be about $35,000 to $50,000 in a year. Considering that these are very young companies, the cost of certification itself is about $35,000 because this goes through continuous auditing of a company for 6 to 8 months to ensure that they're complying to the HACCP standard. I don't know if the HACCP standard is a hazard analysis and critical control point, or the GFSI or the global gap. These are standards that international companies such as yourselves have put in place, and you expect that to partner with a supplier, they must be meeting the same standard requirements. Now, that huge cost has been a big challenge to many of the SMEs, and because of that, they would choose to operate within their small domestic territories. So we've been encouraging governments and private sector to partner together to provide technical capacity building and also to provide effective financial vehicles that can allow SMEs to be able to meet to be able to get certified. Now, thirdly, the issue of online, going online. We were informed by a lot of our businesses that they do not have a platform that can help them to be able to post their products and tell potential buyers, I have 200 tons of potatoes that I can sell on a weekly basis to a ShopRite supermarket. They do not actually have an online marketing platform to be able to post their products. Even if they did, they would also need the technological support to meet that, which would mean smartphones. And there's also a need to also have the companies, the buyers themselves participating on that platform to source their products online. So this has been a continuous gap, and the challenge is that a lot of these platforms are there on a national basis, but they're not harmonized across the region. And this is 19 countries that I'm talking about. So there's a need to actually have that common cohesion of a digital space to market your products and services. Now, what are the key issues that have been faced also on a regional level? When we look at communication, we have realized that a lot of the businesses in Africa, the small and medium enterprises, do not understand the various market segments that they could feed into at a regional level. This has been an ongoing issue, most especially because the companies themselves also do not communicate back to the African suppliers on the kind of quality of products they're looking at or the volumes of the products. So there has been a need to encourage a regional space where there can be an understanding of the current market segments that businesses can feed into. Is it a high-end market? Is it just a larger market segment that has minimum cost? Is it a niche market? So this is something that needs to be developed further in the region. Now, another challenge we've also realized is that, from a macro perspective, is that the regulatory frameworks that have been put in place, even at a regional level, are not domesticated effectively at a national level. And some countries can still put in place rigid or detrimental regulatory systems that affect doing business across the border. We have had countries that protect their own infant industries by setting up export quotas. We've had countries that have set up some TBTs, some technical barriers to trade, to block certain products coming into the market. And this is an ongoing issue that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So every single day, we're trying to unlock one barrier. And with one barrier unlocked, another one comes up. But this is the nature of business within Africa, and we're still trying to see how to sort that out. As we're moving forward, we see the strong political will, especially within strengthening supply chain management systems in Africa. This is also because we have finally woken up to realize that the regional economic integration agenda is so key for businesses, because we cannot work alone. We all have to work together. And for small and medium enterprises on their own, it has been very, very clear to them that if you want to feed into global supply chains, you must come together as consortiums, and you must also harmonize the kind of products that you're selling that have a high value and high impact across the markets. So we're now moving in that direction as small and medium enterprises. On the other hand, we've also realized that businesses that invest in Africa must understand that they have to be responsible businesses. So we are now encouraging companies that are manufacturers and the like that have come into the market to provide a percentage of their investment into technology transfer. We are also encouraging businesses to look at the markets in which they're sourcing from and to ensure that they have fair practices in terms of building the capacity of those small and medium enterprises, setting them up in a way that they can be more sustainable even without selling that particular product, because you can diversify into so many other product lines as opposed to just one that the buyer is accessing. So we're taking this, we're moving in that direction in terms of supply chain management systems. Now, I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions in this particular aspect, but we'll see how to deal with it. I want to recommend one particular thing. A lot of my recommendations have been echoed, so I want to focus on one particular one. If it is possible to have the US government and private sector and governments in Africa as well coming together to provide more affordable schemes of certification for standards for the small and medium enterprises. For us to be able to grow effectively and to become stronger in terms of intra-trade, we need to be able to trade amongst ourselves as well. We need to inspire more consumer confidence in our own goods. And once we do that, any business coming into Africa is also going to be able to trade with a global market. So we're encouraging a lot of support, financing, funding, credit schemes that can ensure that we can have more affordable certification schemes, standard certification schemes. And I'm happy to hear of their solutions and how we can do that together. Thank you.
All right, I really like that we've had a very practical and forward-leaning discussion and recommendations on how we move forward. So not just lamenting the challenges, which were very clear from all of your perspectives, but really some solid recommendations and options that we can look at and sink our teeth into. So thank you to all of our speakers for that. We have, oh, good. We have quite a bit of time for Q&A. So those of you who have been here know the rules of engagement, but for those of you who are visiting us for the first time, let me just outline those very quickly. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand. We will bring a microphone to you. Once you have the mic in your hands, please identify yourself, your institutional affiliation, if any, and the speaker to whom you are directing your question or comment to. I am asking that you please restrict yourself to no more than a minute. As you can see, we have a lot of people here, and I'm sure everybody would like to add some value to this discussion. So I will take 3 questions or comments at a time, give the speakers an opportunity to respond, and then take another round of 3. And I am a big soccer fan. I have a yellow card here and a red card here. If you exceed your 1 minute, you will be hearing from me. So the floor is open. I'll start with my sister right here, go to the woman in the white shirt right there. Sorry. And then the woman right behind her.
Hi, Steve Wright. A question for Mr. Jones. President Trump has threatened to remove the U.S. from WTO. If that were to happen, how would that impact U.S. doing business in Africa? And I guess for a follow-on to Laura, if it happens, what can Africa do to ensure that we continue to make progress?
Okay. And the lady right behind her.
Yes, hello. My name is Astrid Ruiz-Ramon. I'm from the private sector, Boost and Africa Label, which is the Africa division. I work in rural development. And my question is directed at the panel because the panel has covered from the macro, meso, and micro levels. Now, this is focused on trade and development. So my question is trade for what and development for whom? And secondly, what are the positive and negative impacts of aid for development on supply chain development?
Okay. So one more hand. I'll take the gentleman right here.
Hi, my name is Daewon Lee, research intern from the Manchester Trade. Thank you very much for coming here. I really enjoyed it and I learned great stuff. I was wondering that what are the risks of the supply chain of this and how could we kind of manage to optimize the performance of the supply chain? I wonder how could you minimize this risk as well, and could you use insurance perhaps to minimize this risk?
Could you use what, sorry?
Insurance.
Insurance.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so 3 very good questions. President Trump's indication that he might remove the United States from the World Trade Organization, and if that happens, what can Africa do, and what would be the impact on U.S.-Africa economic relations? The second question was about trade to what end and development for whom, and also looking at the issue of the possibility of the negative impact on aid and supply chain development. And then minimizing risk of supply chains through measures such as insurance. So what measures can you take to minimize the risk there? So here's what I'm going to do. I think the very first question was directed at you, Skip, so I'll start with you.
Great, just to toss me a real easy question there. So I think the concern about participation in trade agreements writ large from the current administration is a question of have these agreements worked in the benefit of U.S. workers and firms? That's basically the theme that runs through the look at NAFTA, the look at Korea, the look at the WTO, et cetera. And I think the president, as we've seen with the executive order looking at deficit countries, is asked us to look very closely at what are the causes of these large bilateral trade deficits the United States has recognized and seen, and to what extent do the rules of the road of the trading system contribute to those trade imbalances? That's basically the question. So in terms of the U.S.-Africa relationship, first of all, the trade relationship is by and large balanced. I'm the one Deputy Assistant Secretary in Commerce who can boast that my region has a net trade surplus for the United States. That's because there's a small deficit with Africa and a slightly larger surplus with the Middle East. So, you know, I get a pass when it comes to trade deficit reports. So, I mean, trade's already balanced there, and there's not the same sort of focus that the agreements that are in place between Africa and the United States, largely the WTO, although there are some FTAs across the in Morocco, and well, further around, but that's no longer Africa. That those have worked relatively well. Now, I would say that if one looks at the future of the WTO for enhancing further trade and investment liberalization, the record there over the past couple of decades has been spotty. We haven't managed to make a whole lot of progress, the trade facilitation agreement being the one bright star in an otherwise pretty thin record. I think that the WTO has served the U.S.-Africa business relationship well. I don't think that the major focus of the administration on the trade imbalances has reached or has concentrated on is focused on Africa as a region. There's a lot of room for improvement, but the WTO is stymied in its ability to take advantage of that opportunity. And some of that has to do with the way that the Part 4 of the GATT is structured, the special and differential treatment. And glad to talk to you offline about that, but that's my perception of that situation.
So I'm going to pick it up from there because you asked the question as well. So, and Chris, I'm going to take your points. We need to educate, inform, and communicate. And I think that's what's essential. Because from the first perspective, some of this discussion on trade deficits, let's call it for what it is. If we focus only on goods, there's a lot of places that we have a trade deficit with. 70% of U.S. GDP comes from trade in services. UPS is a services company. We need to add that into the equation and then do an evaluation of where there are surpluses and where there are deficits. And UPS is going to continue to advocate on that. Full disclosure, I was a trade and services negotiator at USTR, big advocate for negotiating and passage of the WTO Financial Services and Basic Telecommunications Agreement. And let me tell, those services transformed a lot of countries and created a lot of opportunities. And they're essential to what the African continent needs to be focused on in terms of facilitating more commerce. Because if you don't have that basic infrastructure of financial services, telecommunications, with which technology can be advanced and fomented and used, as well as the infrastructure, transportation, you have additional bottlenecks. Second point, though, is what do you do if the withdrawal does happen? You know what I say? Keep calm and trade on, because the reality is that business opportunities come from the engagement between two partners that say, I've got something great to sell, I've got something that I want to buy. And companies need to continue to engage in trade because to a certain extent, you need governments eliminating the red tape, but it's through the private contracts that true trade happens, and we need to keep talking about the opportunities that come from that trade engagement. So we have to keep informing and educating, communicating what the benefits of these trade agreements have brought, the greater opportunities that can come when more of the red tape and more of the bureaucracy and more of the regulations that prohibit trade are in place, and we need to keep talking about what comes from when more trade happens. UPS has been trying to be an advocate on that because it's not just about UPS delivering, it's every single package in the back of our package cars. It's every single package in our tractor trailers, in our sea containers, and in our cargo holds. You know what they represent? They represent hopes, dreams, opportunities, and possibilities. And every one of our small and medium-sized customers are depending on us to deliver. We need to educate the administration and every single government around the world about the value of trade engagement. Right now, there's a lot of fear about globalization because people wonder where they personally or where countries fit into that. We need to be talking about the opportunities that come from that global engagement. And like I said, keep calm and trade on.
I'll ask Chris, starting with you, going out that way to pick one of the questions. I think one of the questions there about trade for what and development for whom really has to do, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, has to do with ensuring that even as we advocate for increased trade, that we are not consolidating and widening the gaps in society within African communities. That's part of it, that we're not leaving out the little people, the grassroots people that you were talking about that's on the ground, that sometimes we focus so much on the numbers that we're not looking at the qualitative improvements that economic growth, the qualitative improvements in the lives that trade and development is bringing right at the grassroots. So I will have our three Africans there pick one question, run with it, and let's go.
I'll do trade for what, development for whom as a combined one, because money is what drives development as far as I'm concerned. If you see, so when you say trade for what, I'll say trade for development. You bring money in, let's say it's a ginger farm or a chili pepper farm in somewhere in Africa. You bring money into that, you connect them with some kind of resource, intra-Africa or external. You connect that resource together, their technology and everything we've spoken about. What you're doing now is you're creating a channel, a financial channel. Now that financial channel, what will it do? It will increase the roads, it will bring electricity, it will bring education to that sector. And that's what you need. So the more of those you have in different, you could look at a hub and spoke method, the more of those you have, the more infrastructure comes in, the improvements of life. So trade for what? Trade for finances to improve development in the region. That's what it's for. That's what all grassroots methods are for. All entrepreneurs are all about. It's about starting some kind of business to bring technology in, more people in, improve education, and improve basically social welfare around that environment. So, in my perspective and my humble opinion, when we're trading in Africa and doing trade deals within Africa or outside Africa, what we're trying to do is improve infrastructure coming to my points. And I accept that there's so many points, but I have to be selfish at some point in time. So if everybody is selfish about bringing the points to them, at the end of the day, everybody has done that within different points, and now you've connected a really cool network. I mean, it's I'm not going to go into my geek mode, but it's how networks are set up, right? You have different servers in different areas, in different regions, and you're able to do pings quicker and faster. So if you take that same methodology and you use that same methodology in improving infrastructure, you will have a continent filled with amazing roads, electricity, connectivity online, because every different spot has worked on how can I improve my business and bring in some kind of channel. As long as they don't take that money and go buy a Bentley, then we'll be fine.
Mm-hmm. Sandra, you want to pick one?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to take a different angle from Chris. When you asked that question, I actually remembered some of the success stories within our project. I would say trade for economic wealth, and development for industrial competitiveness across the region. When we, first of all, and I'll also touch on the aspect of aid for supply chains. I personally think that private-to-private partnerships in supply chains works very, very well, because the only gap that has been there within supply chains is the aspect of information, it's the aspect of communication, creating digital spaces that can encourage suppliers and buyers to meet and understand what they can actually benefit from each other. I believe that governments and development partners can come on board to facilitate the regulatory framework that can allow businesses to trade seamlessly across borders, and to also provide the schematics that, like I was talking about, the schemes, the certification schemes that can allow businesses to become more competitive regionally and internationally. Just to give you a fine example of this, within the local sourcing for partnerships project that we held, that we had for about a year, we brought a company in Rwanda into Uganda, and they met a number of farmers, and these farmers had the product that they needed. But they never really considered going there because it was like doing the donkey work. Mm-hmm. They didn't have time to go and gather that information and all that, and the quickest model approach is to work with the existing suppliers, because they would probably go and collect all that information and put together a very comfortable contractual agreement that will just reduce a lot of the cumbersome works in terms of engagement with the company. But they came to Uganda, they met a number of farmers and said, you know what, we can work with you because your product is high-end quality. It's exactly what we need, but we're going to help you to cluster. They did it on their own. Company X, company Y, farmers Y. The farmers came together as a company, and now they're selling their products into the Rwandan market. This is not just happening within Rwanda and Uganda. It's happening between Rwanda and Kenya, Zambia and Malawi, Madagascar and South Africa. It's actually happening, and it's businesses that are doing it on their own. So trading partnerships is for economic wealth at the end of the day. And I hope it is understood that we should not water it down with thinking that development partnership funds are the only way forward in terms of boosting trade competitiveness. I think this is where you're coming from with this. So it's important for us to look at sustainability of businesses from an angle of private to private partnerships as well as public to private partnerships as well. So just to touch on that particular aspect. In terms of development, we as a region are focused on a development agenda. A development agenda that's looking at reducing poverty, reducing corruption within the region, positioning ourselves as global market players. But we also understand that this development agenda is also driven by the private sector. And private sector does not really rely on aid to do this. They have to rely on their startup capitals to grow as infant industries. They also rely on consortiums and partnerships amongst various businesses, internationally and also regionally. And to a certain degree, they also rely on various funding approaches that will allow them to become sustainable in the long run. So aid is very, very, very important, but I think it's also great to understand how aid facilitates economic growth in the region. Thank you.
I'm going to be a little bit rebellious and touch on both the points. I want to mention the supply chain for the goods because I've been involved in a number of these projects. I feel companies, US companies, seeing that we're sitting in the United States, have a lot to offer for local businesses, not just in terms of like trade, but also expertise that they can share with local players. I mean, one of the programs I've been involved in is Coca-Cola's last mile logistic project, which is very well documented. If you take a business like Coca-Cola, some of the same challenges and problems that they face, how to manage their coolers, which links directly to vaccines, and how to manage cold chain, how to manage a fleet of trucks, which touch all businesses. How to route and map a network of distribution. It's not just a question of trade, and we've seen with an initiative such as Project Last Mile that companies have a lot to offer and are increasingly willing to share their knowledge. And I think that's the exciting thing about working with US companies is that, this corporate social responsibility is very much on the forefront of their agenda. And I think we're moving away from just giving money, but actually, donating our expertise and sharing knowledge, like, with the Rwanda initiative, mapping drones, technologies, and all of that. So for me, that's quite an interesting initiative. Then I want to touch on your question on supply chains, and you asked, how can we mitigate risk in supply chains? Well, first of all, I mean, why is there so much risk in African supply chains? And if you look at Supply Chain 101, one thing that a supply chain does not like is variability. So if I go to the customs procedure and one day it takes me 5 days, and the next day it takes 10 days to clear my goods, that is not good for the supply chain. The same for roads. I mean, Skip touched on the donkey roads that some African countries are still sporting. If roads breaks down, if it rains and we don't have paved roads, that becomes a challenge, and then it becomes very difficult to determine exactly how long it's going to take us to get to a specific point, and then how much stock do we need, in order for us to, to mitigate that risk. So infrastructure is very important. Technology can definitely play a role. We've seen with a lot of players, a lot of their supply chain is completely dark because they don't have technology. Once the goods leave their warehouse or their depot, they have no idea where that product is going. They have no idea when it's going to arrive there. So technology can definitely play a factor. In terms of insurance, yes, we've seen a lot of supply chain players are taking on insurance. But the higher the risk, if you operate in a war zone where, somebody is trying to take over your cargo truck, or you have to deal with corrupt police officials going for a border crossing, that is really driving up insurance costs. So you really want to mitigate those risks. And that's how you create, take the uncertainty out of supply chain.
All right, let me take another round of questions. Okay, I just saw a whole bunch of hands go up. So here's what we're going to do. I'll swing from the back here and come down this way. Please, a minute each, no more. The gentleman there, and then the gentleman here, and then I'll swing out this way.
Hi, my name is John Manirakiza. I'm with an agro-food startup. My first question is for Skip.
No, one question, sir, not first.
One question?
One. One question. Let's go.
All right, that's fine. I just ask it to Skip. AGOA has been ineffective in terms of reaching all the stakeholders it was supposed to reach. Some people say that the U.S. has designed it not to benefit the African continent. What is your new approach in terms of making sure that AGOA is beneficial to both the U.S. and Africa? Thank you.
All right, thank you. The gentleman right there near him.
Thank you very much. Manny Iqbal. Question to, I guess, Grace and Sanders and Tielman. What products coming from Africa that are shipped to U.S., do you see an increase in the products besides the normal, the oil and gas, the bauxite and oil, copper and diamonds and all that kind of stuff? In terms of agricultural products and leather goods, do you see an increase? And if so, are there local government officials in the areas that these products are developed that could be talked to help enhance the productivity and increase the liability to make sure that the American counterpart also can increase the demand in purchase?
Okay. Down here, please.
Thank you. Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. Unbelievable. When I came here, I was expecting to be bored, and you reach a certain age, you even fall asleep. This was the most exciting panel. Congratulations. A very specific question.
Can you move the mic up?
A very specific question. COMESA was the model for the trade facilitation agreement. The people who worked on it in the WTO, the GATT, actually had gone to COMESA as one of their examples with their blue and their yellow and their red cards like you described. What I am still finding as the challenge is that so much of trade facilitation in Africa is done on the regional level. Yet when I hear Skip, I hear Laura speak, they always speak about the assistance they're giving to individual countries. And the WTO does represent individual countries. What can be done to bring the regional communities into the trade facilitation exercise and almost make them into the dispensers or supervisors in charge of the aid? Thank you very much.
All right, fantastic. 3 questions. 1, how can we make AGOA mutually beneficial to both U.S. and Africa? 2, can you talk about the levels of finished agricultural leather products that are coming into the U.S. and are there specific nodes that you can identify to really help enhance that? 3, how do we move trade facilitation from a regional from a bilateral framework into a regional framework? Mr. Skip, I believe you're in the hot seat right now.
Thanks very much. So on AGOA, it is true that over the life of the program, the vast majority of the goods coming from Africa to the United States under and benefiting from the AGOA preference have been commodity products, and by and large, oil, the largest single product therein, or product category therein. It is useful to note, however, that the growth rates of the non-oil products coming in under AGOA, although starting from a lower base, have been much more rapid over the recent period. And so that's a very positive trend. The USAID's Trade Africa hubs, one in West Africa, one in East Africa, one in Southern Africa, have spent a fair amount of time working with beneficiary countries on AGOA utilization programs. So how can the country take a better opportunity, can take advantage of the opportunities better to provide the goods covered by AGOA benefits. And the expansion of the AGOA benefits, the last time it was renewed, added, I think, and don't quote me on the figures, but somewhere in the vicinity of 1,500 extra products to the beneficiary status. So working with the the USAID trade hubs on the utilization programs, it's something that each time we have a commercial dialogue or trade and investment framework agreement or a binational commission meeting, that's often a subject of discussions between the U.S. and the African governments. And that approach to make sure that the concept of mutual benefit, I think, is one that is strongly recognized and shared. The agriculture and leather goods, I'm not an Aggie, I don't have the ability to talk at length about that. That maybe there are some people in the audience that have spent more time on that than I do. But increasing the productivity of these products so they can do a better job coming into the U.S. market. Again, I know that the USAID trade hubs have worked with local governments and regional governments on exactly those types of projects. So, and I see some USAID people in the crowd, so maybe they can speak more. Paul, maybe you can speak more about that. And I will pass on the COMESA question. I'll pass it over to Sandra.
Actually, I don't know, Laura, do you want to comment on moving from the regional from the
fact,
bilateral to the regional?
Two comments. One, I just wanted to go back to the question of risk and how to get that out of the supply chain. One of the single most important things related to customs is making things go electronic, right? Because then you have the visibility of the product coming into customs and then continuing on. You know what? There's an app for that information then, allowing you to trace your package from customs all the way to the end consumer. Talk about taking risk out of the supply chain when you can track your package from the day it's taken to the warehouse all the way to the end consumer. Using electronic means and technology is one of the most transformative things that can happen across Africa that can help in terms of streamlining supply chains and taking that risk out of delivery of the products. And so I want to speak to just the one point about technology. You know what it takes to get countries to adopt those technologies? It takes vision. And we've been touching on it when we were talking about the Rwanda project. For those in the audience that aren't aware, UPS partnered with GAVE and the Rwandan government and Zipline to provide the very first global drone delivery service in the country of Rwanda. It didn't happen in California. It didn't happen in New York City. It didn't happen in Dubai. It didn't happen in some, major technology, country in the world. It happened in Kigali, Rwanda, because President Kagame said, I want to bring the most innovative means to address some of our supply chain challenges to one of the most critical issues, the death of too many women in postpartum hemorrhaging after they'd given birth. Find a solution, and I, President Kagame, will work in partnership, and we will deliver better. So you know what? UPS partnered with GAVE, brought that technology in. We are now doing drone deliveries, over 500 a day of blood supplies and just-in-time medical needs. Irrespective of what the roads are like, we brought in innovative technology that delivers to where it's needed. It's that vision plus that technology overlay that can transform everything, which leads me to your question about how we take things from a country level to a regional level. Sometimes it takes that unilateral action. And I have to tell you, Rwanda is leading in that example. They're a landlocked country. They really need to have those access to ports if they're going to achieve some of that dynamism that occurs from trade. Do you know what? Because of Kagame's actions in Rwanda, to kind of change some of the processes and the policies unilaterally, he's encouraged other countries to partner. He now allows free movement of people in and out, which stops that block or that barrier that was about moving businesses and sales representatives across the borders. He's changing his customs processes as well, using a lot more technology and a lot more electronic means for addressing those thick borders. And you know what? Other countries are starting to see in the East Africa region what that translates into. I'll tell you the practical implications of that. It used to take us 19 to 20 days to get something from one of the ports in Tanzania into Kigali. You know what that time frame is now? 4 to 6 days. Boy, wouldn't it be beautiful if it got down to 1? Because you know what? The miles from that port to Kigali shouldn't take that long, but it can be accelerated if there's the vision, the political will, and the electronic and technology means deployed to speed the supply chain. Wonders can happen, but it takes that vision. I would argue you can do a lot through regional trade agreements, and I'm a big believer in not just bilateral, but regional and multilateral agreements. Every means needs to be taken to facilitate the common standards, but sometimes it just takes unilateral action and vision, and kudos to Rwanda for having seized those opportunities in terms of now being the only country in the world where there is a commercial delivery service using drones that, by the way, are now going to be exported to other countries around the world. Our next path is to Tanzania, but that's sometimes all it takes.
Okay, this is a really, really engaging discussion. Let me do this. We're running out of time, and I know there's some questions still to come, but we do have an hour after this where we can continue the discussion, just not in this room. So what I've asked our last 3 speakers to do is to take a minute, pick one question, answer that question, and then we'll bring this up to a close and shift the discussion into the next room.
Okay.
Chris.
I'll focus on the question on products that we're seeing come out of Africa more into the States. So the ones that we've noticed now, remember my company started about really shipping products from the US to Africa, but now we're doing it the other way. So people call it the return ticket. And what we're seeing is hibiscus, gum, Arabic, cashews, chili peppers, ginger. If you want to go into the agricultural standpoint, those are the things that we're seeing more come into the States now than ever before from Africa. So, shea butter also, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, but if you're looking for products to focus on, those are definitely products we've been seeing some high demands on this side of the pond, and we're all limited. So I'll push it to someone else.
Thank you, Chris. Sandra?
Yeah. I thank Stephen for asking that question. In fact, as COMESA, and I'm sure as the other RECs as well, the regional economic communities, we've been implementing the TFA for a very long time. And in fact, we already have solutions to some of these challenges in terms of facilitating cross-border trade. In terms of insurance schemes that can support efficiency along the supply chains, COMESA has an institution called the Africa Trade Insurance ATI. It provides political and business risks to companies that are looking to invest in the market, especially with a keen focus on companies that are investing in high-risk countries across the COMESA region. So it does, in a way, tackle the aspects of some of the impediments within the supply chain network in the region. We also have a commercial bank, a Pan-African commercial bank called it's now called the Trade and Development Bank, previously known as the PTA Bank, that also provides trade finance to businesses that are looking to invest within Africa and also those that are existing in Africa. Now, in terms of cross-border trade facilitation, many countries have come together to set up the one-stop border post system that harmonizes customs procedures across the borders and also allows for a quicker movement of goods or trucks or logistic services across the region. Some border posts are effective, some of them not so much. However, there is a call to ensure that there's at least a regional harmonization mechanism across all the OSBPs so that we can actually reduce time and cost of movements of goods across the region. Within COMESA, we're also looking at facilitating business mobility across the region. So while we're trying to implement the protocol on the gradual elimination of visa requirements in the region, we as a private sector have actually lobbied for, advocated for, and have finally got the Council of Ministers to adopt the COMESA Business Visa Scheme that allows businesses who have invested within the COMESA region to move freely within a number of countries for a certain period of time, as long as they get the COMESA Business Visa Scheme card and they meet the various requirements along that area. So business and trade facilitation is actually very, very key within our agenda. And I'm happy to have this discussion with a number of you over the next 1 hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Tielman, you're bringing up the rear end today, so you have the final word on this.
Let me just see, are there any Ethiopians in the crowd? There's one sitting there. Well, I have never met an Ethiopian who does not travel with a bag of teff in their hand luggage. So teff has just been voted one of the superfoods. So in terms of agriculture products, teff has got great potential. As not just for Ethiopian diaspora traveling abroad, but also in terms of high in iron and very nutritious. So if you want to search the websites, maybe you want to look at teff, which you make injera from.
I'm not Ethiopian, and I travel with teff everywhere I go, so it's good stuff. No, look, thank you. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of this. I know there are a lot of questions. I see a lot of people in this room who have worked AGOA, have worked trade issues, have worked supply chain issues, and I think I know our speakers have done a fantastic job this afternoon of getting to the heart of the challenges, but also giving us some practical recommendations in terms of the way forward. So please join me in thanking our speakers. And then thank you also to the Brown Capital Management team. I mean, without you, we would not be able to have discussions like this. We would not be able to pull in practitioners, Africans, policymakers, and the audience that's vested in Africa, is interested in seeing Africa move forward in a positive direction, is interested in seeing mutually beneficial US-Africa relations participate in this. So again, Keith, Nupur, the rest of the Brown team, I thank you all.